it's my turn.
It is.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Salia. Thank you, Diego. I will begin my brief introduction to this day conference by stating perhaps the obvious, since, let's be honest, as a Portuguese studies scholar working at the University of Parma, I couldn't overlook the existence of an enigmatic, unfinished, and unpublished text written by Fernando Pessoa called The Duke of Parma. This title suggests an unexpected link between one of the greatest authors of 20th century's world literature and the city that hosts our university. Luckily, my colleague, Professor Diego Saglia, was also interested in this text because it is written in English and it clearly evokes such a seminal figure in English literature as William Shakespeare. Besides, it suggests his influence throughout the 19th century neo-Renaissance vogue, that the very literature that formed Fernando Pessoa during his British education in Durban. A bunch of other interesting aspects immediately caught our attention when we started talking about this play and the opportunity to study it and to call upon the expertise of a series of colleagues in order to reflect on the varied issues it raises. So here we are in Parma at the first conference entirely dedicated to Pessoa's Duke, taking the first step of what will hopefully be a long, hard, but also intriguing and exciting journey. It's not as if we recently and accidentally discovered the existence of this piece of literature by delving in Fernando Pessoa's estate. In fact, the common knowledge of this title among the many incomplete and fragmentary works listed by Pessoa is older than us all, dating back to 1966, when Georg Rudolf Lind wrote about his findings in Fernando Pessoa's estate, mentioning for the first time the Duke of Parma, along with another of Pessoa's English dramas, Prometheus Rebound. At this point, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Carlo Spitella, who studied Pessoa's English dramatic works, and especially the Duke of Parma. He couldn't be with us today, but had the courtesy to share some of the information he acquired on the Duke and to put at my disposal some materials he had prepared. As Carlo Spitella stated in 2020, this remained the state of the art for 50 years following Lind's publication. In the late 70s, both Teresa Rita Lopes and Ante Linden brought to our attention the fact that those works remained unpublished. In 1993, João Dionísio, who is among the participants to this conference, introducing his edition of Pessoa's English poems, referred to a collection of lists in which the poet thought through several arrangements for his English works, including both Prometheus Rebound and The Duke of Parma. Those lists are now available in the digital edition of Fernando Pessoa. References to the Duke appear in lists that date from 1913 up to 1913, and apart from those lists, there are other lists. One of them dates from 1909. And Professor Dionísio will talk about them later on. Dionísio also informed us in the aforementioned edition that Fernando Pessoa's literary estate preserves at least 4 dated testimonies. A manuscript dated from 8th of April 1918, a typescript dated from 22nd of June 1919, a manuscript dated from 18th of October 1922, and another one dated from 4th of January 1935. Lopes, in 2004, presented a facsimile version of one page from the drama, dated from 8th of April 1918, in Fernando Pessoa et le drame symboliste, héritage et création, and in 2012, Patrice Ferrari transcribed one line in his doctoral thesis, Meter and Rhythm in the Poetry of Fernando Pessoa. In this paragraph, he wrote, "The meter of Shakespeare's drama was the iambic pentameter, while its form was blank verse." And then, since Pessoa's dramatic works in English still need to be transcribed and published, it is too early to ascertain whether he followed Shakespeare, and if so, to what extent, in the production of his English drama. See, for instance, a fragment for The Duke of Parma, where Pessoa employed the English long-line canonical meter. "All this is mere philosophy, my lord. I spoke of real things, of living, or actual things. The Duke of Parma appears as the example of drama in a loose sheet where several other works are listed. As we can see here, and here you can see the enlarged detail of the lower left side of the sheet. As far as the meter is concerned, Carlos Pitella, in the paper I hinted at earlier, in which he talks about Pessoa's dramatic production in English, makes the following remark. However little we know about Pessoa's 3 English dramas, they seem to have been written primarily in iambic pentameter, or in Pessoa's particular version of iambic pentameter, which sometimes allows itself uncanonical stresses, such as on the 3rd syllable, uncanonical in English, but perfectly acceptable in Portuguese. Pessoa seems to blend the traditional pentameter with elements of Portuguese decasyllabic verse. More recently, in 2021, Richard Zenith added more information on the Duke of Parma in his voluminous biography of Fernando Pessoa. Sorry. Zenith said to have spent a couple of weeks going through the Duke's manuscripts. He points out that the Duke of Parma was conceived in 1909 as a 5-act play and that he kept working on it for the rest of his life. Part of at least one scene was written during his last year, on 4th of January 1935, and this is the document I have already mentioned, with the detail of the date on the top right corner. He also states that it is clearly a Shakespearean play. Not only the English language of his tragedy is modeled on the archaic forms of the Elizabethan era, but, and I quote, more than any oldness or oddness in the vocabulary, or however, it is the tone, phrasing, and dramatic method of Pessoa's play that make us think of Shakespeare. In fact, as we can see here on the right side of this image, Pessoa counted the lines of King Lear, Hamlet, Macbeth, and Julius Caesar on a piece of paper with a scene from the Duke of Parma because he wanted to make sure that the lines in his own tragedy were around the same number as those in Macbeth and Hamlet. These 2 pieces of information, the evident imitation of Shakespearean forms and language, and the long period over which Pessoa carried on his project, lead to one interesting conclusion. The Duke of Parma is not just an exercise in style, a juvenile experiment of an author who is still searching for his own expression and therefore replicates the work of the most authoritative model in a phase of literary apprenticeship, as one could have thought if the manuscript weren't dated. On the contrary, Pessoa kept working on a play written in Shakespearean style well into the 20th century, starting it when he hadn't yet fully discovered his heteronyms, going on through the years when he was at the forefront of Orfeo's modernist movement, then being the director of Athena, and finally when he began achieving some recognition through the critical activity set forth by Presenza's magazine. Therefore, it must have meant something important to him. This project should have played a significant, yet unaccomplished, role in the literary expression of his fragmented self, the only one that really mattered to him. From a thematic point of view, Zenith states that despite the fragmentary and incoherent state of the play's evolution demonstrated by the manuscripts, he was able to identify a storyline in which, and I quote, madness, sex, and sexual abstinence were prominent themes. Zenith transcribed some verses while explaining the topics of the play. The character of the Duke of Parma constructed by Pessoa, according to Zenith's account, is intense, psychologically unstable, and philosophically restless. So, regarding the Duke's instability, he quotes him saying that every face is ugly looked at close, and every soul studied closely has some madness. The Duke's father was himself deranged and became impotent, a trait he seems to have passed on to his only biological son, the then current Duke. Yet the latter, though childless, is not really impotent, only chaste. Having renounced sex, he cannot forget its attractive power, which, however, disgusts him, as he seems to feel repulsion for the female body and sexuality. He asks a doctor among his counselors which is dirtier, the conception of a man or his birth? And a few lines after, he asks, which is the viler, a virgin or a whore? The answer to the latter question, in the Duke's opinion, shouldn't be a whore, but a virgin instead, for one lies with men and the other with her imagination, which is as if she lay with a monster. In the slide you can see in black some little additions to Zenith's transcription made by Teresa Filippo, whom I thank. Zenith elects to quote from the manuscript some words and expressions related to the Duke's repugnance of sex, like insane delight or all's dirty in the world, all. And additionally, on another page cited by Zenith, we can read some lines which seems to me equally significant on this matter. Lust owns at our hearts and all the bent of our lives to forget it and to force our very forgetfulness to be forgotten. The self-unconscious filth of maidens' minds, the closet talk of between wives, the dirt. Zenith even points out a paratextual element, an explanatory note added by Pessoa at the end of a speech by the Duke's constant sexual allusions and their purpose. They are not the author's. They belong to the author's conception of the character of the Duke. Zenith hints at the fact that Pessoa rarely bothered to add this kind of disclaimer about his literature. Therefore, it almost seems like a sneaky admission. The American scholar suggests that this tragedy is quite fascinating and may add some interesting elements to the study of its author, even from a biographical point of view. Zenith also links this annotation to an isolated phrase that was written down in 1912 on a page of a memo book reproduced and transcribed by Pissarro, Ferrari, and Cardiello in Us Objetos. I have never shown what I am. This was meant to be included in a preface to the Duke of Parma that was never written, another interesting piece of information which is added to the puzzle. In fact, the way Pessoa wrote down this note may suggest that the phrase could serve as a title for the intended preface, or at least that it could be viewed as a reading key to the Duke of Parma. We should ask ourselves, who's speaking? Is it the Duke or Fernando Pessoa himself, the one who had never shown what he is? Or is it the author talking through his character, that same author who, as a dramatic poet, insisted on distancing himself from the heteronyms who speak through their literature? Apart from any speculation on the personal motives that may have led Pessoa to characterize the Duke in the way outlined above, the Duke of Parma was a large literary project disseminated in at least 172 documents stored in 2 separate folders at the National Library in Lisbon in Fernando Pessoa's estate, a project that still remains unpublished. And why is that? That's one of the questions I'd like to ask my colleagues here today. Maybe it is because Pessoa's dramatic production has generally been overlooked until recently, since priority was given to his poems or to works such as the Book of Disquiet. Even more so when we consider the dramatic production that he wrote in English. Pessoa, as a playwright in English, is clearly an area that's still underpublished, that still needs studying. It's not as if no scholar have ever had any interest on working on the Duke of Parma. I have already mentioned Carlo Spitella. I also had the chance to hear Patrizio Ferrari revealing during an online presentation of Richard Zenith's biography that Patrick Quillier, the French translator of Pessoa's works, told him repeatedly, "You have to work on the Duke of Parma." So, is it the Duke of Parma the holy grail of Pessoa's literary estate, the last unpolished gem that has to be recovered from his hidden treasure? Of course not, that would be an exaggeration. Even so, it is a fact that no researcher has yet had the nerve and the perseverance required to analyze, read, and transcribe all those manuscripts thoroughly. Evidently, an edition of this play would be a very challenging work. Apart from the papers already identified and catalogued as related to this play, in order to edit The Duke, it would be imperative to revisit Pessoa's literary estate, since relevant fragments may be located anywhere among Pessoa's papers, as the critical edition of Pessoa's Fausto abundantly exemplifies. Pessoa's archive may contain not only bits and pieces of the same play written on documents that also include materials related to other works, but one may also find pertinent lists and plans that could shed light on the origins of this tragedy. It is a very difficult material, mostly penned in a hasty handwriting. Hence, the fundamental task of dating all the documents by analyzing their content, the papers and the inks used by Pessoa, is even more difficult. Then, even after all the documents were deciphered and possibly dated, it would be no easy job for an editor to try and reconstruct a play that was written in a fragmentary, often chaotic and incoherent way, with scenes written here and there, unfinished and non-sequential. Any editor attempting to put everything together to organize such a material into a coherent whole would risk the danger of turning into a co-author. An edition of The Duke of Parma should never be proposed to the general public as a new masterpiece by Fernando Pessoa. In fact, it is not strictly part of Fernando Pessoa's works, because its author never published it and never finished it. Nonetheless, that's more or less the same status of other Pessoa's output that have been published after his death. It would be crucial to find the right editorial solution in order to prevent what Geronimo Pizarro calls the anxiety of unity, putting forward an edition that highlights the alinear nature of the texts. For example, Carlos Pitella, in his edition of Fausto, another work which poses the same kind of problems, opted to present all the fragments in a chronological order. It would be also vital to include a genetic apparatus that shows all the variants that are excluded from the edited text. A digital edition could therefore be the more versatile solution to present a text like The Duke of Parma. At this point, it is no secret that we would like to put forward a project for the edition of this play, possibly proposed and coordinated by the University of Parma, the city whose name is in the title and whose history is part of the subject of this tragedy. Apart from the difficulties resulting from the ectotic issues I mentioned before, this is a text that brings about a series of problems and questions that require the know-how of a number of experts from a variety of multidisciplinary fields. Therefore, I think that an edition of The Duke of Parma should be the work of a team. There should be a small group of researchers who will directly work on the transcription of the documents, equipped with a lot of time at their disposal, along with a perseverance, a good knowledge of Fernando Pessoa's manuscripts, hopefully his English works, and an excellent competence of English, ideally of Elizabethan English, and a strong awareness in terms of meter, in this case the iambic poetic foot, which is often very important in order to establish the text of poetic manuscripts. Evidently, the small group of young researchers must be supported and assisted by consultants with a strong philological know-how and a solid experience in editing Fernando Pessoa's works. The editorial consultants would assist on the hardest parts of the document's transcription and would jointly establish the structure and the organization of the edition. It would be ideal if those consultants came from different backgrounds and had worked with diverse methodologies in order to offer a wide range of solutions from which they would choose the best suited to the specific textual situation. As I mentioned before, a possible solution could be a digital edition of The Duke of Parma. This would obviously involve a range of specific skills and experiences. Luckily, here at our DUSIC department, we can count on a laboratory for humanistic informatics and digital culture, recently formed in 2021 and led by Professor Giulia Raboni, whose competence is internationally acknowledged. The Duke of Parma is a text written by a Portuguese author, but it has more to do with Anglophone literature rather than with Portuguese literature. So, clearly, the project must include at least one expert on this field, and we are glad to have Professor Saglia with us, not only to support the fixation of the text, but also to research into the sources of Pessoa's English drama. So not only this particular consultant should know very well the Shakespearean theatre, that modeled the Duke of Parma, but they may play a key role in the identification of other possible influences like Shelley, Byron, Wilde, or Browning, authors that Pessoa knew very well given his education. As far as the possible sources and influences are concerned, it would be very useful to have on board a researcher with a good knowledge of Pessoa's private library, which, as everybody knows, is kept at the Casa Fernando Pessoa and is available on the website of this institution. It would be crucial to know which readings may have inspired the conception and the composition of this tragedy. Possible marginalia on Pessoa's books would be very valuable in order to study the inception of the Duke of Parma, not only as far as the British sources are concerned, but also in relation to its setting. Could we find in his library the reason why Pessoa decided to write the Duke of Parma? How much did he know about the history of Parma? Do the Duke and the other characters have any historical inspiration? Or are they purely symbolic figures? Of course, in order to answer the latter questions, and more generally to offer an expertise on the historical background of the drama, a specialist on the history of our city should also be part of the team. All these experts would not only contribute to the edition of the Duke of Parma, but they could also obviously develop parallel studies, each on their field. This would make sure that the final result of this project would be a multidisciplinary product covering all the varied aspects of this work. The miscellaneous nature of the intended project is somehow reflected in the program of this day conference, which attempts to develop coherently and sequentially the themes I've tried to summarize in this introduction. So immediately after my foreword, Professor Diego Saglia will open the conference in the attempt to identify plays from the Romantic to the late Victorian eras in British drama and theatre that were influenced by or that reworked themes and settings from Renaissance drama. His study aims to provide a probable backdrop for Fernando Pessoa's Duke of Parma as an additional contribution to its contextualization within the evolution of Britain's 19th century drama and theatre. Somehow linked to Professor Saglia's analysis is Dr. Teresa Filippo's presentation, which will follow a brief coffee break. Starting from the aforementioned reuse in 19th century English theatre of formal structures and themes of Shakespearean dramas, especially the Italian references and settings, she will identify the English and Italian literature available in Pessoa's private library in order to find potential materials that might have had some influence on the creation of the Duke of Parma. Taking a step forward, passing from the sources of the tragedy to its planning, Professor João Dionísio's paper will conclude the morning session. Based on the observation that Fernando Pessoa published a minimal part of everything he wrote, and that is particularly true as far as his dramatic production is concerned, he will show and analyze lists that include the title of the Duke of Parma in order to profile this text in relation to both its chronology and other works by Pessoa that are featured in similar lists. After lunch, we will connect to Bogotá to attend Professor Nicolas Barbosa's presentation focused on Fernando Pessoa's dramatic production. Barbosa will assess the position that the Duke of Parma holds within the author's theatrical corpus, which to this point has only been partially published and researched. The Duke of Parma and other dramatic works in Pessoa's archive will be compared on the basis of their qualitative and quantitative characteristics. Then, the conference will approach questions connected to the genesis of this play and the author's way of working on his manuscripts. Carlotta De Fenu will present an overview of the material characteristics and the authorial interventions revealed by the documents comprised in the Duke of Parma's dossier. So we will hear about the number and the nature of the revision stages occurred during the composition of this dramatic piece, the typologies of autograph interventions, the presence of alternative variants about which the author did not make a definitive choice, or imprecise authorial cues about the order in which the dramatic episodes take place. All this data contribute to the future development of editorial and critical genetic research related to this work. The final session of our conference, entirely dedicated to exotic issues, will be opened by Professor Simone Celani, who will analyze the Duke of Parma's intersections. He will reflect on the alinear nature of Pessoa's writing and the necessity to use philological tools and editorial methodologies that don't necessarily follow the expected paths. From this point of view, the edition of the Duke of Parma can be a testing ground for applying new models. Last but not least, Professor Geronimo Pizarro's presentation will carry on the philological debate, reflecting on some editorial issues posed by Pessoa's English dramatic work on the verge of the project dedicated to the Duke of Parma. My introduction is over. Let the show begin.